The first time I watched a tow truck hook into a neighbor's bumper under the cold glow of a street lamp, I felt the boxy pressure of a countdown starting in my chest. The guard rolled slow behind it like a shadow with a badge, circling at all hours, hungry for violations. I couldn't shake the question, would an obsessive patrol and $300 fees push our quiet cul-de-sac into open revolt? The thought rang like a siren in the gated stillness, and in that moment, I knew the story of this community wasn't about parking spaces. It was about power, and the kind of person who weaponizes a rule at 2 a.m. because they finally found a way to make everyone else feel small. I live in a neighborhood where hedges are trimmed to the inch, and the shrubs look like chess pieces waiting for orders. The board likes order. They say it in glossy newsletters stuffed with stock photos of sunshine and contentment. But nights tell the truth. Nights reveal the lines we draw in asphalt and the people who guard those lines as if the future of civilization hangs on a curb stripe. Somewhere between the guard's flashlight and the soft blink of hazard lights, I felt the fuse light. It was quiet, the air just starting to cool, and I could almost hear the distant tick of sprinklers like a metronome counting down to trouble. I didn't sign up for a war, but a war found me. I had no appetite for drama, just a small home, a family calendar on the fridge, a garage that never quite fit the reality of our lives. We all tell ourselves the rules are there for fairness, and maybe they are in daylight. At 2 a.m., the rules can feel like a trap. That first tow was a warning. The second was a message. By the third, you could taste the tension like iron in the air. And somewhere ahead, I could sense a quiet, patient kind of payback. The board had built a cage. We were about to test the lock. The backstory isn't flashy, but it explains everything, like the droning hum of the gate motor on humid evenings. When I bought here, the association's covenants, conditions, and restrictions were a brick of a document with clauses that read like they were designed by a machine determined to outlaw spontaneity. Overnight street parking technically wasn't allowed, but nobody cared as long as you weren't blocking a fire lane. That was the grandmother rule, the one people honored because it made sense. If the street was clear and your headlights weren't shining into anyone's bedroom, the night would pass, the sun would rise, and the world would keep turning. Then came the spring with its clipped hedges and new faces. The board shifted after the annual meeting, the kind of election where 2 extra hands raised at the clubhouse can change the course of a neighborhood. A woman I'll call Ms. V became president. She had the gift of speaking in bullet points and the certainty of a spreadsheet. Her second act was hiring a security firm to handle compliance. That's how we met the guard, a man with a shaved head and a posture that could have been a coat rack. He learned every car like vocabulary words. He treated the handbook like scripture. He used the radio sparingly but moved with purpose, tracing the same loop until the asphalt knew his tires by name. The revised parking policy landed in our mailboxes with a thud that felt heavier than paper. I still have the sheet, Parking Policy Update dated April 2nd, with a highlight over the new overnight window, midnight to 6 a.m., no exceptions. The page mentioned a towing partnership and stressed that residents were responsible for guest vehicles. The tone was thin and proud, like a trumpet playing one note too loud in a small room. Later, a printed memo slid into the gatehouse binder, Gatehouse Memo dated April 25th, instructing the guard to escalate enforcement to deter what the board called a creeping culture of indifference. The words creeping and culture sat in my head like ants under a door. People adjusted the way people always do. There were new routines. Cars slotted in driveways like Tetris pieces. Garages were bulldozed back into their original purpose. But life doesn't bend perfectly. Teenagers came home after late shifts. Night nurses returned at dawn, too tired to solve impossible geometry. Guests stayed longer when the family talk at the dining table needed one more story. The guard didn't care about stories. He cared about thresholds. Midnight arrived, a switch clicked, and the world divided into compliant and towable. The first wave felt accidental. Maybe the truck was already nearby. Maybe someone called. We always suspected a caller, someone who liked to hear their own importance echoed back to them through a policy. The fees were steep, $300 to retrieve, cash requested, a location in a dusty lot 10 minutes away. By summer's edge, Saturday mornings were a parade of residents with receipts and quiet anger, like pilgrims leaving a shrine where the deity demanded laminated forms. In a normal place, it might have tapered off once people learned the pattern. But patterns only work when they meet good faith on both sides. The guard patrolled like a zealot. If a car touched the curb at 12:01, he documented it like evidence on a case board. If a temporary permit was smudged by a dash reflection, he decided it was invalid, then flagged it. When he needed a tow truck, he radioed with the tone of someone requesting backup for a siege. The tow trucks came, efficient and unblinking. Chains, hooks, hydraulic arms, the sudden lift that makes a car look helpless and indecent. The noise at 2 a.m. was always the worst, a mechanical whine under a sky that was trying hard to be quiet. This wasn't about cars anymore. It was about ownership of nights, the chapter of the day we write with less certainty. The association claimed the hours after midnight like a victorious army, planting signs and issuing warnings. There were whispers, then group texts, then plans. But stories need a trigger, and ours arrived on a weeknight that smelled like wet pavement. The board thought midnight was the end of the conversation. We were about to prove it was a deadline counting towards something they wouldn't like. The night it broke, I had parked on the street for the first time in weeks. My garage had become a maze of cardboard while we sorted donations for a community yard sale. I placed the permit in the window, neat and square, like a plea folded straight. By 2 a.m., the permit meant nothing to the guard. He stood beneath the street lamp, pen ready, calling in the plate. The tow truck sighed to a stop. I watched from the window as my car lifted, rear tires hanging like they were surprised. The sound was both distant and unmistakable, a hollow clank that felt like a verdict. I felt absurdly calm, as if the only reasonable response was to make coffee and start building something with my anger that would outlast the night. Morning did what mornings do, it revealed the damage neatly. The curb in front of my home looked suddenly public, a contested strip of gray. The mailbox carried a yellow slip tucked like a tongue, violation notice with a timestamp of 2:07 a.m. It was stacked with design choices meant to impress, bold font for the code, italics for consequences. The wording was familiar by then, but I noticed a line that made me pause. It referenced the authority to tow on first offense according to CCR Section 7.4 night parking, cross-referenced by an enforcement note. I remembered leafing through the handbook months earlier and not seeing that exact phrasing. I kept the notice like a seed I would need later. The fees made my head go light. $300 paid at the yard would spring the car, plus $35 for the day they called storage. I'm not above paying for my choices, but the scale was wrong. It felt like a trap calibrated to produce shame more than order. The towing contractor, polite and bored, slid a carbon copy across a grimy desk. I added it to my growing pile, the parking policy update dated April 2nd, the gatehouse memo dated April 25th, and now the violation notice at 2:07 a.m. Evidence props in a neighborhood drama aren't glamorous. They're small papers that prove somebody decided the night belongs to them. I began the background work the way a person picks up a puzzle, starting with corner pieces. I reread our association rules. I compared past versions. I leafed through state laws about private property towing, noticing phrases about signage, timing, and the need for clear, visible warnings at entrances. I wasn't hunting for a courtroom win. I was looking for boundaries, the line between vigilance and vanity. The more I read, the more I saw how we'd slipped from neighborliness into something colder. This wasn't the first community to wander into a parking purge. It felt like the prelude to a classic HOA revenge story, the kind you hear in whispers at block parties when the music dips. Neighbors started telling me their 2 a.m. stories in quick, embarrassed bursts. A nurse who'd driven a double shift and gambled on a catnap. A dad whose visiting brother misread the visitor pass instructions. A college kid who parked for 10 minutes to unload a keyboard, returned to an empty space, then stood blinking in the quiet like he'd lost something more than transportation. Everyone sounded small in their own stories, edited down by a rule enforced with missionary zeal. It wasn't just a policy anymore. It was an identity for the guard and the board who'd hired him, a way to be right loudly. I wasn't interested in noise. I was interested in precision. I marked dates on a paper calendar because pen and paper make time feel solid. I taped each notice on the inside of a cabinet door. I wanted to see the pattern whenever I reached for a glass. I logged the patrol times when I couldn't sleep. I learned the melody of his route, the way his headlights slid along the curve like a metronome, always arriving 5 minutes sooner on Tuesdays, always pausing at the cul-de-sac as if the asphalt had told a joke he was trying to understand. By the second week after my tow, I understood the rhythm of the fight taking shape. The board had built a neat construct, an overnight rule, visible signs, and a willing contractor. But neat constructs creak under pressure. People don't live to match the angles of a policy. We bend, we forget, we make do. When a rule has no elasticity, it snaps, and when it snaps, it cuts. I felt the cut when I counted the fees I'd paid and the time I'd lost retrieving a car that had been on a quiet curb, hurting no one. There was another layer beneath the rules. It was the bragging. Not to us, but among themselves. You could feel it in the way the guard moved the next week, a fraction more upright, a touch more certain. Our neighborhood newsletter, always timed to arrive when frustrations are ready to bloom, carried a line about improved compliance and enhanced safety outcomes. It was the kind of bland victory language that hides how people feel at 2 a.m. when they hear chains rattle through a dream. I looked at that sentence and thought about how power misreads silence as consent. Silence can be calculation. Silence can be air filling a lung before a shout. I started planning in the language of escalation measured by minutes, not fury. I didn't want a shouting match at the gatehouse or a viral spectacle. I wanted something structural, something that fit the boundaries we all claim to care about: fairness, notice, proportion. I knew we had homes to run, kids to wake up, bills to pay. But I also knew something else. If a line exists, there's always a way to draw it again with a finer point. The board thought this was about parking spots and willpower. I was counting toward a different deadline, one that would turn their neat rule into a public embarrassment if they kept pushing. Finishing my coffee that morning, I stared at the cabinet door where I'd taped each notice, and I understood that patterns are only helpful when you can show them. The air in the kitchen still held the faint smell of last night's rain, and the refrigerator hummed like a patient witness. I turned the chaos of angry texts into a simple plan: map the patrol, catalog the tows, and compare our papers to the law written for places like ours. I wasn't trying to be dramatic, I was building a clock for a showdown I could see coming around the bend. My first step was time. I started a grid on a yellow legal pad with dates down the left and the midnight to dawn hours across the top. I marked sighting times, tow arrivals, and documented where the guard paused. Within days, the pattern popped out like a watermark: heavy patrols between 1:50 and 2:20 a.m., with a preference for corners where signs were far from eye level. The next step was paper. I printed the association's earlier handbook, the current policy update, and a plain language summary of our state's private property towing rules. I highlighted 3 clauses about signage, notice, and the mandate that lots must have clearly posted tow authority and contact information at every entrance. I slid the packet into a folder labeled entrance signage, state vehicle code highlights dated May 12th, because naming a thing makes it real. I then took a walk, as if I were any late guest hunting for a rule at the gate. I filmed the entrance from the perspective of a driver. The sign listing community rules had small type and sat at an angle where headlights would glare. There was a lot about speed limits and pet waste, but nothing about overnight towing authority, no tow company name, no phone number. At the secondary pedestrian gate, the sign was sun-faded and partly blocked by a bougainvillea vine. When I stepped back to catch it in frame, a sprinkler hissed to life and misted the camera lens, a cool pinprick spray that caught the morning light. If the law required clear warning, we had, at best, a shrug. By noon, I sent a careful update to our neighbors. It wasn't a rallying cry, it was a checklist. I noted the missing details on the entrance signs, the inconsistent placement of visitor pass instructions, and the timeline showing the guard's preferred tow window. I also included a tidy picture collage labeled entrance signs, photos timestamped May 14th, 11:32 p.m., showing the exact angles a driver would see. I didn't insult the board or the guard. I didn't need to. The facts sat still and said plenty. The responses came back with a steady drumbeat: people had paid, people had sighed, people had moved on, but now they were willing to compare receipts. One neighbor provided a towing invoice with a pickup time of 2:11 a.m., and another sent a photo of a visitor pass placed neatly on a dash, dated the same night, with a tow registered at 2:18. I added them to the file and felt something settle. Rage is hot, patterns are cold. Cold works better. Around this time, the newsletter landed with a sunburst graphic announcing a safer neighborhood thanks to enhanced enforcement. The paragraph congratulated residents for compliance and reminded everyone of the strict no overnight policy to preserve emergency access. I clipped it and wrote newsletter excerpt dated May 15 across the top, because even victory laps belong in the record. Nothing in the paragraph mentioned the missing tow authority signs or the 2 a.m. haul-outs that had marred the quiet like jet engines. I knew I was close to the first pressure point, the kind that doesn't require shouting. It requires asking the right question at the right moment so that the answer reveals itself. I requested the next open board meeting agenda and read it like it was a map. I circled 2 lines: discussion, security contract review and new business, signage refresh. They were quiet entries, but together they were a scene. I printed the page and added it to the cabinet collage, board agenda excerpt, June meeting, annotated in red. If the board cared about optics, they'd prefer to finish the signage update first, then celebrate compliance again. If they ignored the order, I could show they enforced a strict rule without posting the required notice clearly. Section 3 of my story reached that low hum around this time, the sound a house makes before a storm. I was ready to step from notes to action, but not with a speech or a spectacle. I would ask for a pause. Not permission, a pause. The ask was simple. I slipped a letter under the clubhouse door and emailed a copy to the association manager. It summarized my findings and asked for a temporary suspension of overnight towing until signage could be corrected. I referenced the evidence props by name, including entrance signage, state vehicle code highlights dated May 12 and entrance signs, photos timestamped May 14. I stated that I had paid the tow fee without contest but requested the board review their notice process. No threats, no legal vocabulary, just a request to align practice with policy. 2 days later, the guard's patrol was unchanged. The tow trucks still arrived with blank-faced urgency. If anything, he seemed more energized, as if attention had made the loop feel like a stage. That night, as I watched his headlights sweep the median, a moth fluttered against my porch light, tapping and tapping like a tiny metronome. It reminded me that persistence isn't loud, it's repetitive. Section 3 closed with a firm click for me when I counted how many notices had accumulated since my own tow, 5 more on our street alone, 3 of them involving guests who'd arrived after midnight due to flight delays. It wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a program. Section 4 began the way summer storms begin in our part of the world, with the air turning heavy and the trees holding their breath. Escalation has a scent, like hot asphalt softening under sun. We all felt it. The board posted a fresh printout at the gate that looked like urgency dressed as order. It added a bold line about strict enforcement and reminded residents that temporary permits must be clearly displayed. Still no tow company name. Still no number. I photographed it at dusk, when the sky turned the color of a bruised peach and a chorus of crickets started up behind the hedges. I labeled the photo gate poster, updated wording, June 2nd, and slid it into the folder. On June 3rd, the meeting began in a room that always felt too cold, freezers humming as if the association wanted to chill tempers by design. The chairs were in neat rows. I sat near the back with my file. I watched the board file in with stacks of paper and the manager with a laptop. When they reached the security contract review, the president praised the reduction in nighttime street congestion and hinted that consistent tow activity had improved response times for hypothetical emergencies. I didn't rise. I didn't speak with heat. I simply asked whether the required tow authority information had been placed at every entrance, noting my photos and the highlighted state code. I asked whether residents who had paid in the last 30 days could expect a review in light of updated signage. The board paused. The manager looked down. For the first time, I felt the floor tilt. They said the signs were being refreshed, that contracts were in place, that safety was the priority. They reminded everyone that rules were clear in the handbook. They said towing was within rights. They said it all gently, like a lullaby. But we had crossed into a space where lullabies don't soothe. Facts do. When they moved to new business, signage refresh, they voted to allocate funds for larger, reflective entrance signs. That single motion sat in the room like a stone on water. Ripples began. If the board moved forward without fixing notice, the consequence wouldn't just be angry neighbors, it would invite questions they didn't want from people who read regulations for a living. Escalation rarely explodes in one moment, it compounds. The guards seemed to take the meeting as confirmation, more rigid now, more precise in documenting permits that had slid a fraction. The tow trucks appeared earlier in the window, often at 1:55 a.m., as if matching his stride. Stories multiplied. A caregiver visiting overnight for a frail parent returned to an empty curb. A contractor working late on a kitchen remodel made the choice to risk 10 minutes and lost the bet. We logged times, totals, frequencies. I updated the grid with a new column, repeat locations. 2 corners accounted for nearly half of the tows. I also noticed the narrative turning in the board's favor in one small but telling way. The newsletter and the clubhouse bulletin used the phrase emergency access like a talisman. People who hadn't been towed repeated it, and a kind of side-taking began. It made sense. No one wants to be the person who opposes safety. I didn't oppose safety. I opposed theater. I wrote that line at the top of my notes: oppose theater, support safety. Then I taped a new item to the cabinet collage: tow receipt batch, 10 invoices shared by neighbors, dated May 21 to June 7, midnight to 2:20 a.m. Around June 8, a different shift occurred, the kind that tells you escalation has moved from internal pressure to visible fracture. A neighbor posted a photo of a tow truck idling with its lights on at 1:48 a.m., clearly visible from the main entrance. The truck waited like a heron at a pond, poised for a car to glide into range. The thread of comments grew. People who once avoided all controversy asked how to get on the next meeting agenda. Others wondered aloud whether the contract paid the security firm based on activity. I didn't speculate publicly, I didn't need to. The appearance alone changed the story. We now had enough paper, pictures, and timestamps to move beyond requests. I drafted a petition, brief and surgical, asking the board to suspend overnight towing until the promised reflective signage was installed and the contract language was reviewed for clarity. I titled it Community Petition for Notice Compliance and Fair Enforcement, June 10, to keep the rhythm. I attached a one-page summary of the evidence props, including the board agenda excerpt, June meeting, gate poster, updated wording, and tow receipt batch. I walked the street with a clipboard under a sky so clear you could almost hear constellations sharpen. By dusk, we had more than half the homes signed. Not rage signatures. Calm ones. At this point, the guard became the face of the program in a way that was unfair to him and also unavoidable. He was the visible instrument. People avoided eye contact at the gate. The 2 a.m. sounds felt sharper, like a saw through dry wood. The board had always liked to speak in general terms about culture and compliance. Now the neighborhood had a different kind of culture, coordination. We agreed to attend the next meeting en masse. We reviewed rules for public comment. We practiced asking questions without heat. We decided on 3 points, repeated like lines in a poem: notice, proportion, review. On June 12, we submitted the petition and asked that it be added to the agenda. The manager responded with a procedural note about deadlines. They would accept it as correspondence but not agenda business. That answer told its own story. When people want to say yes, procedure becomes flexible. When they want to say no, procedure becomes a wall. The next days stretched tight. Every night delivered more evidence. Every morning added witnesses. The air changed in ways you could feel: quieter early evenings, more garage lights on, more neighbors walking the block with phones in hand. We weren't hunting, just watching. There's a difference. By mid-June, we had a mapped patrol pattern, missing tow authority on entrance signs, and a stack of tow invoices clustered around 2 a.m. We asked for a pause, filed a petition, and watched the board vote for new signs while enforcement continued unchanged. After the recap line in my notes, I drew a clean divider and wrote, "Step to leverage." I wasn't ready to explode, I wanted to flip the frame. The association loved process. We would use process. I began drafting recall paperwork for 2 board members most closely tied to the enforcement push, following the association's own bylaws for notice and signatures. Not to punish, but to ask a simple question in the only language the board truly valued: are you still the best representatives for this community? I kept the draft private, shared only with 3 neighbors who had shown a gift for careful steps. Meanwhile, a smaller angle opened. The state rules were unambiguous about the place where signs should sit, what they should say, and how visible they needed to be at night. I took pictures at 10 p.m. of the entrance, then returned at 2 a.m., standing just beyond the reach of the gate's motor hum, recording how unreadable the text became under glare. I combined those shots into a single page labeled Entrance Visibility Study, June 14, Day versus Night. Cold, simple, unarguable. We set a date to present our packet to the manager and asked for a written response with a plan and timeline for signage correction and a temporary towing pause. The manager offered to place our materials in the board's packet before their executive session, which was behind closed doors. That was the association's rhythm: public talk in open meetings, real talk in executive session. I made peace with it. The record matters either way. On June 16, another tow happened on our street at 2:03 a.m., this time a guest car with a permit that had slid an inch. The owner retrieved it at noon. When I added the receipt to the batch, a pattern I had suspected became visible. The tow company always stamped the same yard address, but the release forms had different initials depending on the time of pickup. None of that was sinister. It was just precise. Precision tends to force clarity. The next meeting notice went up: open forum comments limited to 2 minutes per speaker, no action would be taken on items not on the agenda. I didn't mind the boundaries. We had learned to work within lines. But the street had changed. People who had not spoken at any meeting showed up. A couple who'd lost a car at 2:15 a.m. after arriving from the airport sat in the front row with folded arms. A nurse still in scrubs watched the manager with an expression that was neither angry nor impressed. It was simply done. As the board opened the meeting, the room felt tight and very bright, fluorescent tubes buzzing faintly like bees trapped behind glass. The president gave the usual update, praising the forthcoming reflective signs and reminding residents that safety comes first. When the floor opened, the first neighbor asked if the board would consider a temporary pause on towing until the new signs were in place. The answer was soothing and firm: enforcement continues. That answer shifted the neighborhood from escalation to the edge of something else. Not retaliation, not yet, but its outline. The minutes between that meeting and our next move felt like the heavy stillness before wind picks up. Outside, the night air smelled faintly of jasmine from a hedge that had wandered just enough to share its scent. We weren't planning to fight in the dark. We were planning to explain in daylight, clearly and loudly enough to be heard beyond our gate. Not with spectacle, but with a solid record. If the association valued its image, the next step would make them weigh it against stubbornness. I finalized the recall petition language for the 2 board members, clean and procedural, citing the specific bylaws that empower homeowners to call a special meeting. I added the rationale: a mismatch between enforcement intensity and proper notice, a refusal to pause towing during signage corrections, and concerns about proportionality and neighbor impact. I included a single page of supporting exhibits: entrance signage, State Vehicle Code highlights dated May 12, Board Agenda Excerpt, June Meeting, Entrance Visibility Study, June 14. I left out emotion. I kept in facts. We planned the rollout like a calendar. We would collect signatures on a Saturday morning when garage doors were open, when people were out with coffee cups. We would file on Monday to start the clock required by the bylaws. We would then hold a town hall-style gathering on the Greenway to let homeowners ask questions and hear the plan. We weren't staging a coup. We were asking for alignment. If the board aligned, the recall wouldn't need to proceed. That was the quiet offer embedded in the motion. Before the weekend, we also did something gentler but no less strategic. We wrote individual letters to the remaining board members who weren't named in the recall stating plainly that this wasn't an attack on the entire leadership, We acknowledged volunteer work and asked for honest reflection about the current course. We requested a formal agenda item at the next open meeting, consideration of temporary suspension of overnight towing pending signage installation and policy review. Procedure can be a hammer. It can also be a door. Saturday dawned warm and clear. Lawns were busy with sprinklers ticking like metronomes and the soft whir of distant mowers. We wore sun hats and comfortable shoes and carried clipboards. We told the story with 5 sentences and showed the entrance photos. People didn't need much convincing. They had lived the soundtrack for weeks, the late-night hydraulic whine, the morning calls to the yard, the dry official tone in notices. By noon, we had reached the signature threshold. By 2 p.m., we were beyond it. We filed the recall petition that same afternoon, time stamped by the manager's office. The moment the paper left my hand, I noticed a perceptible shift on the manager's face, not fear, not even worry, just recalculation. The association now had 2 clocks running, one for signage installation, and one for a recall hearing. Clocks have a way of focusing minds. This wasn't just a neighbor petition anymore, it was a countdown woven into the association's own rules, and when clocks finish, someone stands in front of a room to face the result. We didn't celebrate. Not yet. We still had to prepare for the voice of the other side, the group who had felt safer under strict enforcement, who liked clear lines, who mistrusted exceptions. We weren't out to embarrass them. We were out to show that rules without notice create punishment instead of safety. The narrative of homeowners association drama only lands when a board trips over its own procedure. We were giving them a chance to step neatly instead. 2 days later, the manager circulated a notice, special meeting to consider recall petition, July 8. It listed the format and the requirement for quorum. It also announced that reflective tow authority signs had been ordered, with an installation target of June 30. It was the first written date we had seen, the first concrete time the board had put on paper. I clipped that notice and slid it into my file under a new label, Manager Notice, June 18, timelines confirmed. Dates are anchors, they stop arguments from floating. In the week that followed, the 2 a.m. tows did not stop. The guard continued his loop, throwing his beam across the same corners, radio static crisp and unhurried. But the tone of the neighborhood shifted from complaint to organization. We practiced our comments for the next open meeting. We coordinated childcare so more parents could stay to the end. We compiled a simple 1-page handout that showed 3 photos, the old sign at night, the new reflective sign mock-up, and the tow receipt batch statistics. Simple speaks. By late June, the reflective signs arrived. They went up with little ceremony, big bold letters with the tow authority name and phone number visible even in the wash of headlights. I tested them by driving through at 10 p.m. and recording from my dashboard. The new sign flashed back like a clean mirror. It was what we had asked for from the start. But the board did not declare a pause as they went in. They stuck to enforcement, as if to prove a point that the policy was always valid regardless of notice. That choice wrote our next step for us. We drafted a second petition, slimmer than the recall, asking specifically for a review of all tow activity during the period when signs were non-compliant. We requested restitution of fees paid by residents and guests in that window, not as damages, not as punishment, but as a correction. We titled it Request for Equitable Review of Tow Fees, Non-Compliant Signage Period. Precise titles carry their own quiet power. The open meeting at the end of June was the most attended I had ever seen. The room smelled faintly of coffee and copier toner, and the fluorescent lights felt harsher than usual. People stood along the walls. The president opened with a bright mention of the new signs and thanked the vendor for quick turnaround. When public comment began, the first homeowner spoke to gratitude for safety, and the second spoke to hardship after a 2 a.m. tow. I waited until the third wave to offer our handout and asked the question we had shaped for weeks: would the board consider a temporary suspension until the recall hearing, to reduce community friction and to honor the spirit of fair notice now that reflective signs were installed? The president smiled thinly and said enforcement continues. The manager added that the recall process would follow the bylaws. The association's rhythm is consistency, and consistency was what they had. But consistency without responsiveness hardens into something brittle. Brittle things break. We left the meeting without raised voices. We stepped into an evening that still held the day's heat, cicadas faint in the trees. We looked at each other and understood we had crossed another line. Section 5 was coming, and it wouldn't be about requests. It would be about pressure applied in the language the board preferred, accurate, public, and persistent. We set the stage for retaliation by choosing light instead of noise. We compiled our packet into a single PDF with clean bookmarks and labeled exhibits, all named exactly as they lived in the file cabinet. We drafted a factual summary and sent it to homeowners who had not followed the details, outlining the timeline, the signage issues, the tow patterns, the unbroken enforcement, and the recall date. We prepared a short plain language explanation of the recall vote and how quorum works. We arranged for a neutral moderator for our Greenway gathering, someone with a calm voice and a habit of calling time fairly. In the background, the guards still circled, the tow trucks still sighed, and the night air moved like warm water across the block. We didn't need to be louder than the board. We needed to be clearer. And as that weekend approached, you could feel an energy rise like heat waves above the pavement at noon. We weren't alone anymore. The neighborhood was ready to insist on proportion with a vote if the board wouldn't accept it as a request. We finished assembling the packet on a Friday evening when the sky settled into a coppery dusk and the sprinklers clicked in sequence along the greenway. The PDF had clean bookmarks, the exhibits wore their dates like little brass nameplates, and the summary opened with a sentence that could not be softened. Enforcement had continued unchanged while notice was incomplete and later corrected. We mirrored the board's tone on purpose. We sounded like a memo. That was the point. When you want a committee to hear you, speak the language of committees until it becomes a mirror. I printed 10 copies on thick paper and slid them into clear sleeves. The front page read Community Record, Overnight Towing Timeline, May-June. Inside, the evidence props looked almost ceremonial, entrance signage, State Vehicle Code highlights dated May 12, Board Agenda Excerpt, June Meeting, Entrance Visibility Study, June 14, Manager Notice, June 18, Timelines confirmed, Tow Receipt Batch, May 21 to June 7. I added the recall paperwork draft behind them like a quiet drumbeat. None of it glared. It just sat there with dates and cross-references, and the calm weight of documentation did what anger could not. The board could ignore our feelings, they could not ignore their own calendar, and the countdown now lived in their rules, not our rage. The following morning, the greenway filled with folding chairs and shade canopies. The air tasted like sunscreen and cut grass. We weren't looking for a spectacle, we were looking for clarity. A retired teacher from the next cul-de-sac agreed to moderate and opened with ground rules. We circulated the packet, page by page, letting people trace the dates with their fingers. You could see realization move across faces not because we shouted, but because the pattern was undeniable. Missing tow authority at entrances until late June, tows clustered around 2 a.m., reflective signs installed at last without a pause in enforcement, recall scheduled for July 8. The feeling in the crowd wasn't fury. It was focus. We outlined the 3-track plan. First, continue the recall timeline, which forced a formal hearing and vote. Second, request a line item on the next agenda for equitable review of fees collected during the non-compliant signage period. Third, document any new tows with precision to show whether behavior changed in light of new signs and rising scrutiny. We emphasized neighbor-to-neighbor respect. No one needed to harass the guard. He was the symptom, not the system. By Monday, the manager acknowledged receipt of our packet and confirmed it would go to the board. That same day, we submitted the formal request for the agenda item regarding fee review and towing suspension pending the recall. The request read like arithmetic, not outrage. I thought of it as the opposite of noise. Noise hopes to overwhelm. Arithmetic requires an answer. Retaliation is a loaded word, but ours felt more like pivot. We adjusted the angle of the story so that the board's favorite tools, procedure, timelines, agendas, now worked against their inflexibility. We kept one more tool ready in reserve, a small step but precise, the state's towing complaint form. We did not flood it, we filled it carefully when a tow occurred after the reflective signs went up and still failed basic proportionality. We attached photos and invoices. We kept copies labeled State Towing Complaint, form batch filed June 26, with each entry signed. It wasn't a threat. It was a ledger in the right column. The guard's loop did not change right away. He circled the same corners, paused under the same lamps, and logged plates with that posture that made him look carved from caution. But the tow trucks now hesitated a little longer at the entrance, idling with engines rumbling like restrained thunder. The new reflective signs flashed the tow company's number back at them as if to remind everyone that notice had finally met daylight. Sometimes a truck rolled through and rolled out without hooking anything at all, like a fishing boat deciding the water looked overfished. We also made a quieter, more ordinary move. We started carpooling in the evenings, neighbors trading spaces and rides so guests could park in driveways. It wasn't surrender, it was discipline. It told the story of a community solving problems even while it challenged a policy's excess. When you show that you can adapt and still insist on fairness, you make stubbornness look smaller by comparison. As July approached, the board sent out the recall procedures packet. It was exacting: quorum thresholds, ballot handling, the date, time, and location. The heat that week was thick and stubborn, coating the sidewalks in a wavering haze by late afternoon. I took the packet and clipped it under a new label in my cabinet: Recall Procedures, Board Notice dated June 29. The paper was cool to the touch even as the air hung warm. The sensory mismatch felt right. On paper, everything was calm. Outside, everything simmered. One more prop arrived without us asking for it. A neighbor shared an image from the association's email system, manager email, July 1, reminding residents of the recall meeting and encouraging constructive participation. It emphasized that overnight parking rules remained in effect and praised the guard's role in preserving access. I didn't react. I printed it, labeled it, and noted the tone. The board was speaking to safety, a value no one opposed, but using it to justify an inflexible enforcement program that had already been adjusted by necessity. It's hard to abandon a story once you've cast yourself as its hero. That's why you let the calendar do the work. We spent the final days building a simple slide deck for the recall meeting, a visual translation of our packet. Every exhibit got one slide with a title in plain text. We included a single chart plotting tow times against the non-compliant signage period and the installation date of the new reflective signs. The night before the meeting, I practiced my remarks aloud in the kitchen while the dishwasher thrummed a steady beat and the patio lights cast a pale grid on the tile. I planned to stick to 3 points: notice, proportion, and the board's refusal to pause towing after signs went up, signaling a preference for posture over peace. We didn't bring signs or slogans. We brought copies, dates, and a timer. Climax lives in quiet moments as easily as in noisy ones. The recall meeting began at 6 p.m., the clubhouse air cold enough to make fingertips sting, fluorescent lights steady and merciless. Homeowners signed in, collected ballots, and drifted to seats. The board sat at the front table in their careful row, and the manager stood off to the side with a laptop, the screen casting a pale glow like reflected moonlight. The moderator hired by the association read the rules, presentations from both sides, timed comments, ballots to be counted immediately afterward in view of attendees. The president spoke first, praising safety gains, noting the new reflective signs, and arguing that consistency had improved the neighborhood. They acknowledged the towing fees were painful but framed them as necessary to deter a culture of laxness. The words slid across the room in a polished ribbon. People nodded. Some folded arms. Some looked at their ballots as if searching for a different question to answer. When it was my turn, I walked to the microphone with the packet in one hand and a small kitchen timer in the other. The timer ticked softly like a nervous cricket as I placed it on the table. I spoke about notice, citing the entrance signage, state vehicle code highlights dated May 12 and the entrance visibility study, June 14, showing how unreadable the entrance signs had been at night. I pointed to the manager notice, June 18, that set the installation target, then to the night when reflective signs finally went up. I spoke about proportion, naming the 2 a.m. cluster plainly and the narrow window when the guard's loop and the truck's arrival overlapped like the jaws of a small trap. I ended by asking a question I'd written and rewritten until the words felt finished: if fairness matters, why was there no temporary pause once the signs improved, especially while a recall was scheduled and community trust was fragile? I didn't suggest motives, I didn't read tone. I kept to dates and choices. I let the calendar and the dollar amount say what they say. When the moderator signaled time, I stopped. We handed the floor to anyone else who wished to speak, and people stood in orderly sequence. A man who'd never spoken at any meeting described retrieving his car with his mother waiting at home and the feeling of returning to a house that had saved and planned for years to be here. A woman with a visiting caregiver talked about the late-night scramble and the morning call. A resident who supported the board's posture spoke about emergency access and the comfort of predictability. The room did not splinter. It clarified. Then came the detail no one planned, introduced by the treasurer with the kind of breezy confidence you develop after years of reading numbers from a sheet. He confirmed that towing fees did not flow to the association, which we all knew, but added that the security firm's contract included a performance bonus keyed to documented enforcement actions, tow or not. It wasn't a smoking gun, it was a hinge. You could feel the room lean. The performance bonus wasn't about money changing hands from tows, it was about incentives aligned to activity, not outcomes. That single sentence reframed the guard's posture. It made the loop look like more than vigilance. It made it look like a quota's cousin. I didn't celebrate. I took a breath and wrote performance metric, security contract disclosed July 8 in the margin of my notes. The detail didn't require drama. It required a vote. Ballots went into boxes, and volunteers counted at a long table near the windows. Outside, dusk pulled the sky down to mauve, and lightning sheeted far off without sound, like heat catching its breath. The room buzzed at a low, rustling pitch. People tried small talk and failed. It wasn't suspense as much as fatigue getting close to change. The count finished in under an hour. The moderator stepped to the microphone and read the result. Quorum met, recall successful for one member, not the other. The president was recalled, another remained. The room didn't cheer. There was no gloating. There was a hush that felt deeply adult, like the moment you realize a small institution can turn gently if you push in the precise place. The board conferred briefly and returned with an interim plan. They announced a temporary suspension of overnight towing for 30 days while the new board majority reviewed enforcement protocols and signage placements. They promised a public agenda item to address equitable review of fees during the period before reflective signs. It was a policy voice trying to sound responsive. It was also the right answer. There was a small round of polite applause that sounded like rain tapping a window. I stepped outside into the evening and let the warm air spread over my skin like a blanket. The clubhouse lights hummed behind me. Somewhere near the gate, the new reflective sign threw back a clean, unambiguous shine. The climax didn't feel like victory fireworks. It felt like the sudden quiet that follows a long machine finally shutting off. Aftermath always arrives with details, not headlines. The first detail was immediate, the guard's loop changed. He still patrolled, still checked corners, but the radio stayed quiet after midnight. Towing had paused. The silence felt luxurious, like a hotel pillow after a red-eye flight. The second detail came a week later at the scheduled meeting. The new board majority placed equitable review on the agenda and presented a narrow, careful motion, refunds or credits for towing fees paid between May 1 and June 30, the period documented as having incomplete notice. They attached a process, submit receipts and dates, receive a response within 30 days. It wasn't perfect. It was procedural and a little stiff. It was also concrete. Neighbors began to file their paperwork, stapling tow yard receipts to simple forms, referencing dates we had all memorized. I watched the line move at the clubhouse like a small river, steady and patient. The treasurer read a cash flow statement and proposed using contingency funds to cover the credits, with a plan to recover a portion by renegotiating the security contract's performance metric into an incident threshold metric tied to outcomes like emergency access, not raw activity. It was an accountant's kind of repentance, dry and useful. A third detail signaled change at a deeper level. The newsletter arrived without a sunburst graphic. It carried a sober paragraph acknowledging the signage oversight and the community's effort in documenting the timeline. It thanked residents for civility during a contentious month. It stated plainly that overnight street parking rules would be reviewed with an eye toward flexibility, especially for late-night arrivals, nurses, caregivers, and guests with legitimate needs. You could feel grudges thaw a degree. Not vanish, thaw. The recalled president moved out of the spotlight gracefully, or as gracefully as such things allow. The security firm replaced the performance clause with a monthly flat rate, and the guard's posture softened. He still stood upright, but it looked like a human being's spine, not a rack. He waved at kids on scooters. He lingered under lamps without that hawk stutter, and he stopped treating the tow truck schedule like a magnum opus. Nights became nights again. I brought my receipts and received a credit against dues with a formal letter reading approval, equitable review, dated August 5th. The letter sounded like any letter. In my kitchen, in front of the cabinet door that had once been a collage of dates and angles, it felt like a small ceremonial bell concluding a service. Was it perfect? No. Some fees took longer to resolve. A couple of residents insisted enforcement should never have paused. A few emails tried to reframe the story as dramatic neighbors versus responsible leadership. But the harder truth carried more weight. This wasn't neighbors from hell or HOA ridiculous rules in a cartoonish sense. It was a case study in how incentives and notice shape behavior, how a midnight rule became a 2 a.m. machine, and how a community turned its own bylaws into a lever. As for me, I slept through the first quiet night and woke up to a street that felt normal in a way I had nearly forgotten. The air at dawn had a faint coolness that whispered of a seasonal shift. The gate motor hummed its usual baritone. The reflective sign at the entrance caught the first sunlight and flashed a brief, clean gleam, then went ordinary again. I took down the cabinet collage and filed the papers in a single folder. I labeled it parking, spring, summer, filed and closed, because even petty wars deserve a neat ending. I wondered what the guard thought when the tow truck stopped coming at 2 a.m. Maybe relief. Maybe a bruised pride. Maybe nothing. That's the secret with systems, people inside them often adjust with less drama than we expect. The real pivot lives in policy. And policy had moved. The best part wasn't the credit. It was the return of proportion. A late guest could park without a pit in their stomach. A nurse could come home to the stillness she'd earned. A visiting brother could misread a visitor pass and receive a polite warning instead of a $300 scavenger hunt across town. Safety did not suffer. Fire lanes were kept clear. The real emergency, the one where neighborliness is bled dry by zeal, eased back from the brink. I kept one thing taped inside the cabinet though, a small slip that read Community Petition for Notice Compliance and Fair Enforcement, June 10th. Not as a trophy. As a reminder that order means nothing if it isn't paired with notice, and that sometimes the most satisfying revenge story is the one where the villainy is really a miscalibrated machine, and the victory is to tune it instead of torch it. You could call it petty revenge HOA and miss the point, or you could call it what it was, a collective insistence that rules serve people, not the other way around. In the weeks that followed, summer settled in fully. Evenings smelled like grilled corn and citronella. The Greenway reclaimed its role as a place for lazy games and patient gossip. The new board majority began a parking task group with volunteers from each street to map choke points and propose a permit system that made sense. They invited the night shift nurse to review the draft. They asked the contractor who'd been towed while unloading cabinets to talk through staging limits. They treated the handbook like a living thing, not a museum piece. The most telling change arrived late one night when a thunderstorm roared without warning. Rain hammered the streets like a drumline, and the power flickered, then steadied. In the middle of it, a small convoy of cars pulled to the curb, hazard lights blinking, drivers making way for a crew repairing a neighbor's sparking transformer. No one worried about a tow. The guard blocked the street with his truck for safety, radio quiet, posture steady in the flashing rain. The neighborhood watched from porches, warm light spilling from doorways, the air smelling like wet asphalt and relief. It wasn't a cinematic ending. It was better. It was ordinary headed home. Tell me your HOA horror in one line.